I had some quick thoughts I wanted to share regarding Ether chapter 2. I think it's verse 8 that says, the people, the inhabitants of America, need to serve the true and living God or else be swept off. Something to that effect. The point is, that hit me is it says true and living God. So he's a real God, he's a living God, he's able to give revelation. And one of the revelations he gave is that he established the Constitution. That's truth. And he established a further truth. Whatsoever is more or less, as far as government of man goes on this nation, comes of evil. So the thought hits me, first off, serve. So not just like and appreciate and go along with it as a casual observer, but actually serve. And then second off, you can't. I don't believe that verse was meant to say that everybody had to become members of the church. Maybe, I don't know, but the thought that hit me was, I think what the Lord is saying is He expects us to follow the Constitution. There's so many witnesses of that, and if we stop following the Constitution, which He told us, whatsoever more or less comes of evil, period. He's never taken that back. Brigham Young stood by the Constitution. John Taylor stood by the Constitution. Wilford Woodruff stood by the Constitution, etc. And then I'd like to point out also three witnesses. First off, the principles of the Constitution that I recently noticed. So Elder Oaks, in 1987, he had been an apostle for 3 years. Gave a talk, I guess in Provo, entitled Our Divine Constitution, or Our Divinely Inspired Constitution, something to that effect. This was not at BYU. This was not a general conference talk. And that's the talk where he lays out how he came up with his 5 inspired principles of the Constitution. And the first time he was challenged, I believe at the University of Chicago as a law professor, by a non-member professor who had been a professor in Utah, as to explain why so many students kept saying that the Constitution is divinely inspired. Well, first off, to me, if the Lord says it is true, and it's up to us to figure it out. But that's what President Oaks did. He sat there working on it and figuring it out. And he gives us the 5 principles. He gave them in a different order back then. And he wasn't as emphatic. You could tell he was still working on it. He had only been an apostle for 3 years. L. Tom Perry then quotes those in 1987 at BYU. This is the bicentennial of the Constitution, so I think it's either September or October. And L. Tom Perry says he loves those principles that Elder Oaks gave at the time. And then President Oaks reiterates those principles in his talk called Our Divinely Inspired Constitution in 2021. Part of the introduction, and those principles are much more clear, much more solid. He actually starts off re-emphasizing first the sovereignty of the people, which that didn't used to be the first thing he said. It used to be the 5th thing he said. And he said more definitively, maximum freedom is required. And he said at the beginning of the talk, the most important studies of the Constitution he had done had been during his 37 years as an apostle. So all those other years of experience at University of Chicago and everything else, Supreme Court, all that kind of stuff, he said, no, the most important years have been as an apostle. So no wonder that those same principles that he was teaching that were reiterated by Elder Tom Perry, so that's twice, he reiterates them, but in a newly established, more authoritative, more powerful order in his talk, defending our divinely inspired Constitution. Now, also I want to focus on 1987 for a second there. So that same year, 2 talks at BYU, and then the 1 talk at Provo that I just mentioned. But the 2 talks at BYU were Truth and Liberty by L. Tom Perry, and then Freedom and Free Agency by Dallin H. Oaks. I highly recommend those. And then in 1986, September 1986, and maybe this is significant, maybe it isn't, you tell me, but apparently the Constitutional Convention, its earliest forms began to kind of come together at the Annapolis Convention in 1786. So the bicentennial of that would have been in September of 1986, and that's when President Benson gave his talk called The Constitution, a Heavenly Banner, which then he also made into a longer book form. So it's a long talk form, first of all, at BYU. And then the following year in September, he gave conference talk, a general conference talk called Our Divine Constitution. And all three of those, he testifies of the prophecy of Joseph Smith and that it still hadn't been fulfilled, that the time was coming when the members would need to step up to the plate and the citizens would need to step up to the plate and save the Constitution. And he gives us the principles for how we're supposed to do that. And President Benson said, that the Constitution would be saved by those who understood the principles of the Constitution. Now, President Benson taught his 5 principles. They're really worth comparing to the 5 principles that Dallin H. Oaks taught. But I would look at both of them, especially what Dallin H. Oaks said. So what I'm seeing there, I'm seeing 3 witnesses at BYU. Our Constitution, a Heavenly Banner, Truth and Liberty, and then Freedom and Free Agency. I'm seeing 3 witnesses to the prophecies and exhortations of Ezra Taft Benson, the Constitution, a Heavenly Banner book form, BYU talk version, and then our Divine Constitution, I believe is what it's called, given in General Conference just a year later, and which apparently it was a year after that Annapolis Convention that began in 1786. That's 1787 is when we have Constitution Day, right? So, anyhow, I find President Oaks to be very interesting to study. I've studied both him and Ezra Taft Benson a lot in the past, and I love both of them. President Benson, it's more like farmer wisdom, if you ask me, where he just says, this is right, this is right, this is right, and he just knows it's right. All of his political experience, he got it while he was an apostle. So it's like the Lord was giving him all this like apostle-like guidance while he's serving in the government, while he's doing this, while he's doing that. That's the Lord's way of teaching. That's really intense. And then President Oaks, he got his experience first in the world and then turned around and wrote books called The Lord's Way, where he emphasizes how the Lord's way is so much more effective than the world's way. Not that the world's way is worthless, but it's actually quite good too. And so I recommend studying that book by President Oaks. And I can't help but see little things in there that justify me saying that Ezra Taft Benson was taught more the Lord's way straight up front about the Constitution. And that President Oaks, like he said, 37 years of being an apostle have been his most important years of studying the Constitution. So look at that talk defending our divinely inspired Constitution and compare it to what he was saying years earlier, which was already very solid. But I'm just saying, I see 3 witnesses to the principles of President Oaks. I see 3 witnesses to the prophecies and exhortations of Ezra Taft Benson. And, of course, I see 3 witnesses to the importance of the Constitution. That less than the Constitution was insufficient, but that more than the Constitution is also too much. And it needs to be followed in truth, right? Truth and Liberty is the name of the talk from L. Tom Perry. We need to serve the true and living God. Truth matters. Read the actual Constitution. L. Tom Perry says in his talk, Truth and Liberty, how can we serve the Lord and serve the Constitution if we haven't drunk deeply from the fountains of its wisdom, or something like that? So in other words, somewhere in there at that point, he's saying, read the Constitution, you guys. You actually have to read the Constitution. President Benson said we needed to defend the Constitution specifically in the tradition of the founders and according to what the prophets have told us, because the Lord said he established the Constitution by wise men who he raised up. So there's 2 people involved there, the wise men who the Lord raised up. So we need to study those men, those wise men who the Lord raised up, and we need to study what his prophets have said, because his prophets continue to serve the Lord and know what his will is regarding it. So I can find all sorts of other commentary on the Constitution, but to me, when I read those talks that I just mentioned, and when I read the Constitution itself, and those wise men, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John Dickinson, all those guys, that is, to me, that's the wisdom of understanding the Constitution. Most specifically the text, because those wise men who the Lord raised up regularly referred to, just read what the text says and just follow it. Don't tell me how you're going to filter this text through the old British tradition. Don't tell me how you're going to filter it through this or that. Just read the text of the Constitution. And so to me, I think that's the way we're supposed to be serving God. Tell me if you disagree. And to me, I think I've seen literally what the President Oaks talked about in his book, Pure in Heart and the Lord's Way and what have you, and just that these 37 years of being an apostle prior to 2021 when he gave that talk have been the most important years of studying. I think he's been through an amazing man who was already converted so much. Just sounds so much more authoritative, and I don't know if I expect to hear him talking about the Constitution a whole lot more. That's not for me to predict. It's not my stewardship. I just kind of throwing out some testimony of them and some things that have impressed me about those guys. I'd read their words and get your own impressions. Read the Constitution itself, get your own impressions, all that kind of stuff. Anyhow, thanks for listening, you guys.